I was standing in my daughter's kitchen, wiping my hands on a dish towel when she looked me in the eye and said, "Either do as my husband tells you, or pack your things and leave right now." Her words hung in the air like the steam rising from the pot roast I'd just taken out of the oven, and I could feel the muscles in my jaw clench as our old horse Charlie let out a whinny from the barn outside. I don't know if it was the smell of rosemary and beef or the glint of expectation in her husband's eyes, but something inside me snapped, and I knew I couldn't go on living under their roof like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. Before we get into how I responded to that ultimatum and what happened to me, to her, and to Charlie, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what you're doing while you listen. Your roll call messages help me feel like we're all sitting at one big table together. My name is George, and I'm a 71-year-old widower from rural Missouri who still believes in handshake deals, Sunday dinners, and the comforting creak of a rocking chair on a wooden porch. I built our family farmhouse in the early 1980s with rough-hewn cedar posts and a roof of corrugated metal that sang during rainstorms. Every board was nailed with love and sweat, and every corner had a memory attached to it. My wife, Ruth, was the heart of our home. She baked pies for the county fair and sang hymns while we mucked out stalls. She passed away from a stroke 15 years ago, and since then I've clung to routine and to the animals that still needed care. Our only daughter, Emma, was born in 1988, a December baby who arrived during a snowstorm that closed the roads. We named her after Ruth's grandmother and wrapped her in a quilt that smelled of lavender and sawdust. From the time she could walk, Emma followed me around the farm, pulling up carrots and feeding grain to the chickens. When she was 6, I surprised her with a chestnut horse we named Charlie after my grandfather, and the two of them became inseparable. Charlie was more than a horse. He was a friend, a protector, and a mirror for Emma's moods. If she was happy, he pranced around the paddock. If she was upset, he would nuzzle her shoulder until she smiled again. I taught Emma to ride by, starting her on a lead rope, then turning her loose in the pasture, trusting Charlie to keep her safe. She learned balance, patience, and respect from that horse as much as she ever learned from me. For years, our lives revolved around farm chores, school plays, and Sunday church. I was proud of Emma's work ethic and her gentle spirit, and I believed that she would carry those traits into adulthood. Emma went to college in St. Louis to study veterinary science, but a semester before graduation, she met a man named Brad at a fraternity party. He swept her off her feet with his cologne, his fancy car, and promises of a life where she wouldn't have to get dirt under her fingernails. Brad worked in real estate, flipping houses and talking about interest rates like they were playing cards. He wore tailored suits and had a way of making everyone in the room feel small if they didn't keep up with his fast pace. When Emma brought him home to meet me and Charlie, he barely patted the horse's neck and avoided stepping in mud with his expensive loafers. He smiled at me with teeth too white and asked about my plans for the farm as if it were a speculative asset. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt because Emma's eyes sparkled when she looked at him. He proposed 6 months later, and they married in a barn we decorated with strings of lights and bales of hay, though Brad insisted on adding uplighting and a dance floor that looked out of place among the cows. After the wedding, they moved to a suburban house near Springfield. But 2 years later, Brad's latest real estate venture went sideways. A buyer backed out at the last minute, and he found himself underwater on a loan, complaining that banks always hold your money hostage. He wasn't wrong about banks holding money. Under federal regulations, banks are required to make the first $225 of most check deposits available the next business day and the remainder by the second business day. But for large checks, they can place longer holds and must notify the customer. I know this because I've been dealing with banks my whole life. I've deposited wheat sale checks that took days to clear and once had a buyer's check for a tractor get held for 9 business days because it exceeded the threshold. Brad, however, didn't understand that nuance. He thought money should appear instantly and that any delay was a personal slight. So when his funds got tied up and a deal fell apart, he turned to Emma and asked if they could come live at my place until the next opportunity presented itself. I hesitated. The farmhouse was my sanctuary, and Charlie still lived in the barn. But I missed having Emma around, and I didn't want to be the reason they struggled. So I agreed on the condition that we all respect each other's space and contribute to the household. For the first few months, things seemed fine. Brad woke up late and took calls at the dining table. Emma helped with chores and renewed her love of country living, and Charlie enjoyed extra treats from my granddaughter when she visited on weekends. Then the cracks appeared. Brad complained about the smell of manure near the driveway and insisted on parking his Lexus in the barn where Charlie had lived for decades. He suggested I sell the pasture while the market is hot, and when I refused, he scoffed as if I were clinging to an obsolete notion of land. One evening at dinner, he slid a printed budget across the table and informed me that I should contribute more to our household expenses, because I was retired and had savings. He conveniently forgot that I paid the mortgage off 30 years ago and covered utilities while they figured out their next move. Emma began spending more time indoors, scrolling through real estate apps with Brad and nodding along as he discussed flipping properties in states I'd never even heard of. When I asked if she still wanted to finish her veterinary degree, she brushed me off, saying she had different priorities now. I started keeping a journal of these moments, not to spy on them, but to track how often my boundaries were crossed. Each entry was a reminder that our relationship was shifting in ways I hadn't anticipated. I also looked up our state's tenant laws because if things went sour, I needed to know my rights. Missouri, like many states, treats long-term house guests who pay rent as tenants, which means I'd need to give them 30 days' notice to move out and follow the legal eviction process if they refused. Self-help evictions, where a landlord changes locks or shuts off utilities without a court order, are illegal, and landlords who do so can face penalties and lawsuits. Learning that made my stomach tighten because I realized that if Brad and Emma dug in their heels, getting them to leave wouldn't be as simple as telling them to pack. One afternoon, I overheard Brad on the phone bragging to a friend that he was living the dream by having a built-in ranch hand to cook and clean while he waited for his next big deal. He laughed and said, "George doesn't mind doing the work. He's got nothing else going on." Those words stung more than I expected. I thought of the calluses on my hands, the years of raising Emma, and the way he minimized my existence to a punchline. I went out to the barn and leaned against Charlie, letting his warm breath soothe my anger. I also called my friend Hank, a retired attorney who understands rural property disputes. He invited me over for coffee, and we sat on his porch watching hummingbirds dart between feeders as he listened to my situation. Hank nodded and said, "You need to protect yourself, George. Make sure your will is updated. Keep your money in accounts Brad can't touch. And if you decide to ask them to leave, document everything. Courts are backlogged these days. You could wait months for a hearing." I asked him about consent laws for recording conversations just in case I needed to prove what was said, and he reminded me that Missouri is a one-party consent state, meaning I could record a conversation I was part of without notifying the other party. Even though I knew it was legal, I decided I didn't want to go down the path of secret recordings. There's something about living your life like a courtroom drama that feels wrong when you're a farmer at heart. Instead, I began saving receipts, emails, and text messages. I printed them and stored them in a folder in my gun safe, next to Ruth's wedding ring and the deed to the farm. These documents were my backup plan, and they gave me a sense of control even as Brad started acting like he was lord of the manor. Tensions peaked on a Saturday morning when Brad stormed into the barn and demanded that I shovel horse manure elsewhere because he didn't want his leather shoes to get dirty. Charlie snorted as if he agreed with my assessment of the situation. I told Brad he could either grab a shovel and help or move his car. He rolled his eyes and said, "That's not my job. Your job is to keep this place presentable while I handle the finances. That's the deal." I reminded him that the deal was temporary and that we were supposed to respect each other. He laughed and walked out, leaving boot prints in the straw. That was the day Emma came to me with her ultimatum. She held Brad's hand and said they had been talking, and decided that if I wanted to stay in the farmhouse, I needed to agree to serve them by cooking, cleaning, and tending to Charlie while they focused on rebuilding their empire. I looked at Charlie, then at Emma, and felt a swell of sadness and anger. I could not believe my daughter, who once sang to that horse under the stars, would stand by while her husband reduced me to a servant. My decision came from a place of clarity, not spite. I told them I would not be serving anyone like a butler in my own home. Instead, I would be giving them 30 days to find somewhere else to live. Brad smirked and said I couldn't evict them because we were family and they had rights. I calmly replied that I had consulted an attorney and would follow the law, which includes a proper notice and, if necessary, an eviction filing. I wrote a formal notice that afternoon, printed it, and handed it to them. I also sent a copy via certified mail for good measure. The notice gave them until the end of the month to move out and reminded them that changing locks or shutting off utilities without a court order was illegal, so they need not worry about being locked out. Emma's face fell, and she whispered, "Daddy, please don't do this." But I held firm. I told her I loved her, but love without respect is hollow, and I would not be used as a stepping stone for Brad's ambitions. In the days that followed, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Emma cooked meals for herself and Brad and stopped coming to the barn. Brad made calls in hushed tones and packed boxes, occasionally slamming cabinet doors to make his displeasure known. I continued my routine, feeding Charlie, mending fences, and visiting Ruth's grave, with a mix of sorrow and relief. I spent long evenings on the porch journaling and sipping coffee while the sun set behind the cornfield. I also met with Mrs. Jenkins at the local bank to discuss moving some of my savings into certificates of deposit. She reminded me that when I received large payments, like if I sold part of the farm, the bank would hold a portion for several business days per the Expedited Funds Availability Act, something Brad seemed to ignore in his schemes. Mrs. Jenkins also suggested I set up a revocable trust to protect my assets and ensure that Emma and any future grandchildren would benefit without Brad having access. I took her advice and scheduled a meeting with an estate planner. The 30 days came and went. Brad and Emma, to my surprise, did not move out. Instead, Brad filed a lawsuit claiming I had promised them the farmhouse in exchange for help around the property. I knew this was untrue, but I also knew that the court system would take time to sort it out. Hank helped me file an eviction case, and we gathered my folder of receipts, texts, and journal entries as evidence. The court clerk told me the hearing would be scheduled in about 2 months because the docket was full. I gritted my teeth and prepared for a long wait. During those 2 months, Brad tried to turn Emma against me completely. He told her that I was selfish and wanted to die alone. He even suggested that Charlie was too old and should be sold or put down to save money. Emma cried one night in the barn, burying her face in Charlie's mane. She said she didn't know what to do. I told her she had to decide whether to stand by her husband or stand up for her father and herself. The hearing day arrived with a cold rain that turned the driveway into a muddy path. I wore my cleanest pair of jeans and a crisp button-down shirt. Hank carried our evidence in a manila folder. Brad showed up in a suit that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover, flanked by an attorney I'd never met. The judge listened patiently as both sides presented their cases. Brad's lawyer argued that I had made an oral agreement to give them the farm, which I refuted. I presented my evidence of providing notice and my journal entries that documented the ultimatum. The judge asked if Brad or Emma had made any payments toward the mortgage or property taxes. They admitted they had not. The judge then explained that without proof of ownership or a formal contract, their claim was weak. She granted my eviction request and gave Brad and Emma 2 weeks to vacate. She also warned Brad that if he attempted to damage the property or interfere with my livestock, he would face criminal charges. We left the courthouse relieved but weary. Hank reminded me that court orders sometimes need to be enforced by the sheriff if the defendants refuse to comply. I nodded, prepared for any outcome. Fortunately, Brad saw the writing on the wall and began packing. Emma quietly started loading her things into her car. I helped her carry boxes and told her she could still visit whenever she wanted, but she needed to respect my home and my boundaries. Before they left, I gave Emma one last hug and told her to remember the girl who used to ride Charlie bareback at sunset. I slipped her a copy of the trust documents so she'd know she was still in my plans, even if Brad wasn't. When their cars finally disappeared down the gravel road, I stood next to Charlie and watched dust settle. I felt a heavy weight lift from my chest, even as tears blurred my vision. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into restoring the farm to the peaceful place it once was. I painted the barn doors red like Ruth always wanted, reseeded the pasture, and built a new shelter for Charlie with extra padding and fresh bedding. Emma called me occasionally to tell me about her life. She confessed that Brad's business had failed again and that they were renting an apartment in the city. She apologized for the ultimatum and said she understood why I had taken a stand. I forgave her because forgiveness is as much a gift to yourself as to the other person. I also reminded her that respect must flow both ways for a relationship to thrive. I think about Charlie often. He's older now, with a graying muzzle and slower steps, but he still perks up when he hears Emma's voice over the phone, and he still follows me around the pasture like a loyal dog. This ordeal taught me that boundaries aren't walls. They're gates you control. They allow love to enter, but keep exploitation out. If you're dealing with a similar situation, I urge you to educate yourself on tenant rights, consent laws, and banking policies. Knowing the law is not being paranoid, it's being prepared. Remember that banks have specific rules about funds availability, landlords cannot change locks without proper notice, and court cases take time. Plan accordingly and document everything. Most importantly, remember your worth. You are not an employee to your children or their spouses. You have given them life, love, and lessons. They should return respect, not demands. Thank you for listening to my story. Please share in the comments where you are listening from and whether you've ever had to set a boundary with family. Your stories help others feel less alone and remind us that strength comes in many forms. Subscribe for more true stories of quiet courage and practical wisdom. And until next time, hold your ground with grace and never forget your dignity. As the dust settled and life returned to a quieter rhythm, I found myself revisiting memories that I hadn't thought about in years. Sometimes the past is like an old barn. You forget what's stored inside until you open the door. One such memory involves my own father, Henry, who taught me how to swing a hammer and fix a tractor engine before I could drive. He believed in teaching skills one slow step at a time and letting me fail safely so I'd learn to stand back up. Henry also told me that when someone shows you who they are, believe them. He learned that lesson the hard way when a cousin borrowed money and never paid it back. Dad wrote the loss down in his ledger, underlining it twice, and said, "Never mix kindness with gullibility." That ledger is now in my possession. The paper is brittle, but the lessons are crisp. I flipped through it recently and saw scribbles about feed costs from 1959 and a note about a bank hold on a cattle sale check that lasted longer than expected due to bank policy changes. It reminded me that banking rules have always existed. Even back then, Henry wrote, "Bank says funds not available until Tuesday. We'll wait," a precursor to the modern reality of $225 next day availability and second business day releases. These recollections matter because they anchor me to a lineage of people who faced hard choices and still chose integrity. I try to continue that lineage for Emma and for anyone who hears this story. While we're on the topic of lineage, I remember when Emma was 12 and entered her first horse show with Charlie. She was nervous, gripping the reins like they might slip out of her hands, and I whispered, "Trust him, he knows the way." They trotted around the ring, and though they didn't win a ribbon, the smile on her face when she dismounted was worth more than any prize. She hugged Charlie's neck and said, "Thank you for carrying me," as if the horse understood every word. That moment came back to me when she stood in my kitchen issuing an ultimatum. I wondered where the girl who thanked a horse had gone, and if I could help her find her way back. In the early weeks after Brad and Emma left, I busied myself with the things I'd neglected during the drama. I repaired a sagging fence line, cleaned the gutters, and resealed the barn roof before winter. Each chore gave me a sense of progress and control. When I was nailing down a loose board, I recalled a time in my 20s when a windstorm tore the roof off our barn. Neighbors from miles around showed up with hammers and sandwiches, and we raised a new roof in a day. We called it a barn raising, but what we really raised was community spirit. That memory inspired me to reach out to my neighbors again. I hosted a potluck and invited the families along our road. They brought casseroles, pies, and fold-up chairs, and we spent an afternoon swapping stories and laughing under the shade of a big oak tree. One neighbor mentioned that his son was interested in agriculture but didn't have anywhere to learn hands-on skills. I offered to teach the boy how to care for animals and maintain equipment. Before long, I had a small group of teens coming by once a week, eager to learn. Teaching gave me purpose and reminded me that the farm could still be a place of growth and learning, even if my own family dynamic had shifted. I found solace in writing letters, not just to Ruth, but to my future self. I'd describe my day, how the sky looked at sunset, or the way Charlie's mane shone in the golden hour. I'd tuck the letters into a box labeled "For Later" because sometimes reading your own words helps you see your life from the outside. I also started attending a grief support group at the local church. Most of us were there because of losses of spouses, but as we shared our stories, we realized that grief isn't limited to death. It also encompasses the loss of dreams, relationships, and even homes. One woman spoke about losing her daughter to addiction. She recounted how she had to set boundaries and how painful it was to watch her child struggle. Hearing her reinforced that I wasn't alone in making hard choices for the sake of sanity. After each meeting, we would light candles and say names out loud. When I said Ruth and Emma, I felt a lump in my throat. I wasn't grieving Emma's death, but the loss of the relationship we once had. Acknowledging that helped me begin to heal. In addition to the support group, I joined an equine therapy program as a volunteer. They pair horses with veterans and children with disabilities, teaching them trust and connection. Charlie became a therapy horse, his gentle demeanor soothing anxious participants. Watching a veteran with PTSD brush Charlie's coat while telling me about his time overseas reminded me that everyone carries unseen burdens. We can't control how others treat us, but we can choose to meet them with empathy and firmness. Outside of volunteering, I spent afternoons at the county courthouse researching property laws and attending public hearings. I wanted to understand how other seniors navigated landlord-tenant disputes and estate planning. At one hearing, I listened as a man in his 60s described how his son had attempted to sell the family home while his father was hospitalized. The court was sympathetic, but the case had been pending for over a year because of docket delays. Hearing that made me grateful I'd acted quickly and documented everything. In my research, I discovered that some states require two-party consent for recording conversations, which means everyone must agree to be recorded. I silently thanked my decision not to record Brad because if I had moved to a different state, I could have inadvertently broken the law. Another takeaway from those hearings was the importance of clear written agreements. Handshake deals might work between neighbors with trust, but when family relationships are strained, written leases, wills, and trusts protect everyone. I updated my estate documents to reflect Emma's situation and consulted with Hank and the estate planner to include specific provisions for Charlie's care. I didn't want him to end up in a stockyard if something happened to me. In the middle of these legal and emotional tasks, I didn't neglect joy. I set up a small vegetable garden, planting tomatoes, beans, and zinnias. The act of nurturing seeds into plants grounded me in the present. One afternoon, I pulled a weed and unearthed an old toy tractor from when Emma was little. The paint was chipped and the wheels barely turned, but I cleaned it and placed it on a shelf in the living room as a reminder of simpler times. I also adopted a rescue dog named Max, a lanky mutt with floppy ears and a tail that never stopped wagging. Max quickly became Charlie's companion, chasing his tail while Charlie looked on with equine bemusement. The sight of Max and Charlie together made me laugh out loud, a sound that felt foreign after months of tension. I realized laughter is like sunlight for the soul, and you have to seek it out. My granddaughter Lily, Emma's daughter, started spending weekends with me. She would brush Charlie's mane and ask questions about his younger days. I told her stories about her mother riding bareback and about the time Charlie nudged Ruth into a water trough, making us both laugh. Spending time with Lily allowed me to pass down knowledge and traditions. We baked pies using Ruth's handwritten recipe cards, their edges yellowed but legible, and we listened to old records on the turntable, dancing clumsily in the living room. I made a habit of reading before bed, something I hadn't done consistently since Ruth was alive. Books about history, farming, and psychology filled my shelves. One book explained how boundaries help relationships thrive by defining expectations and responsibilities. The author compared boundaries to fences. They keep the livestock safe without severing them from the pasture. That metaphor resonated deeply with me and reaffirmed that asking Brad and Emma to leave was not an act of cruelty, but of preservation. I also discovered podcasts about senior living, financial planning, and storytelling. Hearing other older adults talk about their lives made me feel part of a wider community. One episode focused on the dangers of elder financial abuse, cautioning listeners to watch for red flags like sudden changes in banking patterns or unauthorized withdrawals. The host urged listeners to set up dual alerts on their accounts and to designate a trusted friend or family member to monitor statements. I took that advice and added Hank as a read-only viewer on my bank account, giving him the ability to spot irregularities without granting him control. That same podcast episode interviewed a banking executive who explained how deposit holds work and why banks must hold funds to mitigate risk. She said, "It's not personal, it's protection," echoing what Mrs. Jenkins had told me. Learning more about these systems made me less fearful of them. Knowledge turns the unknown into the understood, and understanding reduces anxiety. On the legal side, I began attending local bar association seminars on elder law. The attorneys spoke about guardianship, powers of attorney, and the importance of choosing someone who truly has your best interests at heart. One lawyer told a story about an elderly woman whose niece petitioned for guardianship under the guise of care but intended to sell her home. The case took over a year because of court delays. In the end, the woman was able to keep her house, but the stress nearly broke her. Stories like that motivated me to put clear instructions in my legal documents and to talk openly with Emma about my wishes so that there would be no confusion in the future. Emma, to her credit, attended a therapy group for family members of narcissists. She told me later that she'd begun to see patterns in her relationship with Brad and how her need for approval had blinded her to his manipulation. Our conversations became more honest. She apologized again for her ultimatum and said she felt ashamed. I told her shame can be a teacher if you listen to it and then move past it. We gradually rebuilt trust by sharing small moments, laughing over Lily's mispronunciation of words, exchanging recipes, and musing about the weather. Our relationship resembled a fence line repaired after a storm, stronger at the broken points. Occasionally, Brad would send Emma messages asking for money. She showed me the texts, and together we practiced saying no. We treated each request like a weed. If you ignore it, it spreads. If you pull it out by the roots, you protect your garden. Charlie continued to be a source of comfort and connection. His presence drew neighbors, therapy participants, and family to the farm. He reminded everyone of the simple joys of brushing a horse, feeling his heartbeat through your hand, and smelling hay in the morning. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky shades of orange and pink, I sat on the fence with Lily and Emma, watching Charlie graze. A light breeze carried the scent of alfalfa and distant rain. Little did I know, I thought, that the ultimatum Emma gave me would lead to this moment of peace and reconnection, and that Charlie would still be here, steady as ever, bridging the past and present. My days now are full but not frenetic. I still wake early, brew coffee in the same old percolator, and feed the animals before the rooster crows. I walk the property lines to check for breaks in the fence, not just because livestock might escape, but because boundaries matter in all things. I've created a small office in what used to be Emma's playroom. There's a desk made of reclaimed barn wood, a comfortable chair, and stacks of notebooks filled with thoughts, plans, and the occasional doodle. Every morning, I spend 20 minutes writing. Sometimes it's mundane details like weather and chores. Other times it's deep reflections on grief, forgiveness, and aging. Writing is like sharpening a tool. It keeps your mind keen and ready. If you're thinking of starting a journal, I encourage you to do so. You don't need fancy paper or perfect handwriting. You just need honesty and consistency. Years from now, you might look back and see how far you've come. On Sundays, I still attend church. I sit in the same wooden pew where Ruth and I held hands during sermons. The hymns comfort me, but so does the coffee hour afterward when we share news about our gardens and grandchildren. One Sunday, a new family attended, a mother, father, and 2 teenagers fresh from the city. They sat nervously until the congregation welcomed them with smiles and casseroles. Later, they asked me about the farm and if I needed help with anything. Their enthusiasm reminded me that community is a living organism. People move in and out, bringing new energy and ideas. By sharing my story with them, I ensured that lessons learned would ripple beyond my immediate circle. Another aspect of my new life is travel. I've always wanted to visit the Grand Canyon, so I decided to drive there last spring. I packed a cooler with sandwiches, loaded Max into the truck, and hit the highway. Along the way, I stopped at roadside diners, antique shops, and quirky attractions like the world's largest ball of twine. I chatted with waitresses, truck drivers, and fellow travelers, finding common ground in our love for the open road. When I finally stood at the rim of the canyon, the vastness took my breath away. The layers of rock told a story of time, erosion, and endurance. I thought about my own layers, carved by experience and weathered by hardship. On the return trip, I listened to a mix of classic country and audiobook thrillers. One thriller involved a courtroom drama that seemed to resolve in a week. I chuckled, knowing from my own experience and from Hank's that real court cases take much longer. Travel also broadened my culinary horizons. I tasted Navajo fry bread, Texan brisket, and New Mexico green chili stew. I brought home spices and recipes, adding variety to my cooking routine. At a farmer's market in Colorado, I met a beekeeper who explained how bees communicate with dances and pheromones. His passion inspired me to take a beginner beekeeping class when I returned. I now have 2 hives buzzing behind the barn. Beekeeping taught me patience and attentiveness. You can't rush bees, you have to move calmly, check for pests, and respect their space. It's a metaphor for human relationships. Intrude too quickly, and you might get stung. The honey I harvest is darker and richer than anything at the grocery store. I give jars to neighbors and Lily's school for fundraisers. Sweet gifts build goodwill and remind me of the symbiotic relationship between bees and flowers. While I've embraced new activities, I haven't neglected financial planning. I meet with a financial advisor quarterly to review my investments, budget, and charitable giving. Together, we evaluate market trends and adjust accordingly. We also discuss contingency plans. Should I need long-term care in the future, I've looked into nursing home policies, Medicaid eligibility, and long-term care insurance. I keep a binder with contact information for facilities I'd be comfortable calling home. Preparing for the future isn't pessimistic, it's practical. Just like I check fences after a storm, I check my legal and financial documents regularly to ensure they still reflect my wishes. Another critical lesson I've learned is the importance of digital literacy. Scammers target seniors through email, text, and phone. I attend free classes at the library to stay current on cybersecurity, learning how to spot phishing emails and create strong passwords. I installed two-factor authentication on my bank accounts and social media profiles. I also educate my peers, sharing handouts and explaining how adding a phone number or authentication app can block unauthorized access. My friend Martha did not protect her accounts and ended up with thousands of dollars in unauthorized charges. The bank refunded some after an investigation, but she spent weeks on the phone with customer service. Her experience reinforced my commitment to staying vigilant. Speaking of vigilance, I've become more aware of my physical health. As we age, muscle mass and balance decline. I joined a senior fitness class at the community center where we use resistance bands and light weights to maintain strength. Our instructor emphasizes proper form and listening to our bodies. She also encourages us to stay hydrated, which is easy to forget during busy days. Staying fit means I can lift hay bales and move furniture without injury. I also visit my doctor for regular checkups. We monitor cholesterol, blood pressure, and bone density. Catching issues early allows for manageable interventions rather than crisis treatments. During one visit, my doctor asked about stress and sleep. I told him about the ultimatum in the court case. He nodded and said chronic stress can be as harmful as smoking. He suggested I practice meditation and guided breathing to calm my nervous system. I was skeptical, but I downloaded a meditation app and tried a 10-minute session. Focusing on my breath felt awkward at first, but gradually I felt my shoulders loosen and my mind clear. Now I meditate 3 times a week. Meditation has even helped my relationship with Emma. When she calls with news or frustrations, I listen without interrupting, take a deep breath before responding, and choose my words carefully. This small pause reduces knee-jerk reactions and fosters understanding. In addition to meditation, I practice gratitude. Every night before bed, I write down 3 things I'm grateful for. Some nights it's big, like Lily's laughter or Charlie's nuzzle, and some nights it's small, like a perfectly ripe tomato or a good cup of coffee. Cultivating gratitude shifts my focus from what I've lost to what I still have. It prevents resentment from taking root like a weed in a garden. Another practice I adopted is saying no more often. When neighbors ask for favors I can't reasonably provide, I politely decline and offer alternatives. Setting limits conserves my energy and prevents burnout. I've learned that you can't pour from an empty pitcher. By prioritizing my well-being, I have more to give to those truly in need. As I reflect on everything that's happened, I see the ultimatum not as a rupture, but as a fork in the road. Had I acquiesced, I might still be in that kitchen, serving a man who didn't respect me and losing pieces of myself each day. Choosing the other path meant discomfort, confrontation, and legal proceedings, but it also opened doors to new hobbies, friendships, self-knowledge, and a deeper relationship with Emma and Lily. If you're on the fence about making a difficult decision, consider the potential growth waiting on the other side. Map out your plan, consult professionals, gather documentation, and take one step at a time. Don't let fear of court delays, bank holds, or family drama keep you from protecting your dignity. These processes exist to ensure fairness. They may be slow, but they are there for you. Finally, remember that animals like Charlie have much to teach us. His patience, loyalty, and ability to live in the moment remind me to savor simple joys and to stay grounded when human relationships become complex. As you finish listening to this long story, perhaps take a moment to pet your dog, water your plants, or sit in the sun. Reconnect with the world outside technology and paperwork. I hope my journey has offered both cautionary tales and hopeful possibilities. The road to reclaiming dignity is winding, but it's lined with wildflowers, songbirds, and unexpected companions. Please leave a comment telling me your own experiences with setting boundaries, your favorite rural memory, or the name of a beloved animal in your life. I read every comment and often find wisdom in your words. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who might be struggling with a similar situation. Sometimes, hearing that someone else stood up for themselves can light a spark of courage. I'll be back soon with another true story of family, courage, and the quiet power of doing the right thing, no matter how hard. Until then, stay strong, stay informed, and give Charlie a carrot from me. Sometimes I find myself standing at the edge of the pasture watching the clouds drift by and thinking about my own childhood on this land. I can still see my younger self running barefoot through the clover, chasing fireflies while my mother called me in for supper. My mother, Evelyn, was a schoolteacher who could quiet a room of rowdy children with a glance. She balanced her stern looks with soft hands that kneaded bread dough and braided my sister's hair before church. Evelyn taught me my letters at the kitchen table by candlelight, sliding a pencil across lined paper and tracing my hand to show me how much I'd grown. She also taught me to recite the multiplication table before I could milk a cow alone. My father, Henry, was a man of few words who expressed affection through work. He built our barn, mended our fences, and rarely complained about the back-breaking labor that kept us fed. He believed a man's word was his bond, a lesson that stuck with me when Brad tried to twist my promises. I remember one winter when a blizzard trapped us inside for days. We played card games by kerosene lamp and took turns reading passages from a worn Bible. It was during those quiet hours that I felt the weight of family and the warmth of togetherness. As a teenager, I joined 4-H and raised a pig named Wilbur. I fed him before school and practiced my speech about animal husbandry with my reflection in a dusty window. The skills I learned then, discipline, care, presentation, helped me later when I stood before the judge explaining my side of the eviction case. When I turned 18, the Vietnam War was raging, my draft number was low, and I enlisted out of a sense of duty. I remember the smell of boot polish and gun oil, the weight of the rucksack, and the humid heat of the jungle. I wrote letters home to Ruth, who was then my high school sweetheart. Her letters smelled faintly of her perfume and described everyday happenings like canning peaches and training Charlie, who at the time was just a yearling. In the chaos of war, thinking about Ruth brushing Charlie's coat grounded me. It reminded me that there was a future waiting on the other side of the conflict, one that involved hay bales, not sandbags. When I returned from deployment, I felt older than my 22 years. Ruth met me at the bus station wearing a blue dress with a ribbon in her hair, and we hugged for what seemed like an eternity. We married that summer in her parents' backyard under a trellis covered in climbing roses. Our honeymoon was not an exotic trip, but a picnic by the river. We ate fried chicken, watched the water flow, and talked about where we'd build our home. We had $200 between us, hope, and a willingness to work. We broke ground on the farmhouse that fall. Friends and neighbors came to help pour the foundation and lift the walls. There was music, laughter, and potluck dishes spread across sawhorses like a banquet. Building the house by hand forged my confidence. It taught me that I could turn raw materials into something sturdy and beautiful. That same confidence came back when I stood up to Brad, reminding me that I could shape my life's structure too. Ruth and I spent many evenings dancing in the empty living room before the furniture arrived. She would hum along with the radio, and I'd spin her under the rafters, our boots scuffing the newly sanded floor. When Emma was born, the house smelled of fresh paint and diapers. We carved her height into the doorframe on each birthday, a timeline of growth still visible today. I refused to paint over those marks, even after Brad suggested a modern update. Emma's teenage years were typical and turbulent. She dyed her hair purple once and brought home a boy who played in a garage band. We argued about curfews and chores, but we always reconciled over pancakes on Sunday mornings. She fell from Charlie at 15 when he spooked at a rabbit. She broke her arm, but insisted on getting back on the horse once the cast came off. That fall taught her resilience and the importance of facing fear rather than avoiding it. When she started dating Brad, I saw some of the same rebellious spark. I hoped she would choose someone who respected her and her roots, but sometimes lessons must be learned firsthand. I think about the first time Emma introduced Brad to Charlie. Charlie sniffed him and then turned his head away as if unimpressed. I wish I had trusted Charlie's judgment more. Animals have a way of sensing things humans overlook. Throughout my life, animals have been companions and teachers. Besides Charlie, there was Daisy the milk cow, who nuzzled my hip while I milked her, and Rusty the barn cat, who kept mice at bay and curled up on my lap when Ruth died. After Ruth's death, I clung to the rhythm of chores to keep from drowning in grief. Feeding animals, repairing fences, and chopping wood were actions that didn't require thinking about the empty chair at the table. Emma helped then, cooking dinners and sitting on the porch with me in the evenings. We'd watch the sun sink and talk about school, friends, and Charlie's latest antics. Those conversations felt like a bridge across the chasm of loss. When Emma left for college, the house felt cavernous. I started attending community events more often to fill the silence. I joined a bowling league and discovered that I wasn't half bad at rolling a 12-pound ball down a lane. Bowling may seem unrelated to family drama, but it taught me about follow-through and patience. If you release the ball too soon, it veers off course. If you hold it too long, you lose momentum. Boundaries require similar timing. During those college years, Emma would call to ask how Charlie was doing. I'd tell her about his new habit of chewing on the gate latch or chasing butterflies. She'd laugh and say she missed him more than dorm food. I visited her on campus once and brought Charlie along. We paraded through a small park and gathered a crowd of students who wanted to pet him. Emma rode him bareback in her sundress, and for a moment I thought maybe she would return to her equine roots. Emma's interest in veterinary science seemed promising. She interned at clinics and shadowed large animal vets. I imagined her taking over the farm and turning it into a rescue or therapy center. I didn't foresee her pivoting to real estate through Brad. When Brad asked for Emma's hand, he did it in a restaurant over prime rib, not under a tree like I had. He asked me for my blessing using business jargon, not heartfelt sentiments. I hesitated but said yes, because Emma looked so certain. Now I realize that my blessing may have been perceived as approval of his character when it was just love for my daughter. Sometimes our love blinds us, and hindsight sharpens our vision. As Brad's behavior changed, I kept thinking back to the values Ruth and I tried to instill in Emma: respect, gratitude, hard work, and kindness. I wondered where those values went when she agreed that I should serve Brad. Part of my healing has been recognizing that adults make their own choices. I cannot control Emma's decisions, but I can model integrity and hope she chooses that path when the time is right. I've also learned to differentiate between helping and enabling. Helping empowers someone to act, while enabling removes their responsibility. By asking Brad and Emma to leave, I stopped enabling their dependence and forced them to face their own circumstances. One neighbor, Sam, once told me that the hardest part of raising kids is letting them fail. Sam had to watch his son lose a job due to laziness. He said the pain of watching was worse than the pain of taking over the task himself, but if he had intervened, his son might never have learned. Hearing Sam's story gave me courage when my own boundaries felt harsh. It reminded me that kindness sometimes means stepping back so someone else can step up. During this journey, I've confronted not only external conflicts but internal ones. I struggled with guilt. Was I abandoning Emma by asking her to leave? I struggled with anger. How could she disregard me? And I struggled with fear. What if I ended up old and alone? Journaling, therapy, and talking with friends helped me process those emotions. When guilt surfaced, I asked myself if my actions were harmful or necessary. When anger flared, I examined what boundary had been crossed. When fear crept in, I reminded myself of my support system. At the food bank where I volunteer, I met a veteran named Harold who faced a similar dilemma. His daughter demanded he sign over his home for her to use as equity. He refused, she stopped speaking to him, and he felt torn between love and self-respect. Harold and I compared notes on eviction processes and legal strategies. We laughed at the irony of two gray-haired men discussing tenant law like we were first-year law students. We supported each other in our choices and promised to keep in touch. A few months later, Harold invited me to his granddaughter's 4-H show, where she showcased her goat and won a blue ribbon. Seeing another family celebrate responsibly gave me hope for the next generation. Another example comes from my neighbor Karen, a widow whose adult son moved into her basement and refused to pay rent. She initially let him stay out of sympathy, but when he started bringing strangers home at odd hours, she served him notice and sought legal counsel. Karen's experience was messy. Her son accused her of being unloving and tried to guilt her into changing her mind. She cried on my shoulder more than once. Yet, by the time he left, she had gained confidence in her ability to stand alone. Stories like Karen's and Harold's reassure me that drawing boundaries is a common struggle among seniors. We grew up in a generation that prized hospitality and generosity, and sometimes those traits are exploited by those who see us as easy targets. To protect ourselves, we must adapt without losing our kindness. We must learn the laws, monitor bank accounts, and update wills. We must remember that love doesn't require sacrificing our well-being. As I navigated these waters, I took time to appreciate the farm's natural beauty. There is something soothing about watching the sun rise over dew-covered fields, hearing the rooster crow, and feeling the crisp air fill your lungs. I started capturing these moments with a small digital recorder, not to record conversations, but to capture sounds like Charlie's snort, bird song, and the sound of rain on tin. Sometimes I play those sounds before bed to remind me of the peace that surrounds me. Those recordings help me sleep better than any pill. They transport me back to a time when life was simpler, and the biggest concern was whether it would rain enough to fill the cistern. If you live in the city and miss the countryside, consider downloading nature sounds or visiting a local park. Closing your eyes and listening to the wind can calm your nervous system and remind you of the world beyond screens and stress. As fall turned to winter, I prepared for colder weather. I stacked firewood under the porch, insulated pipes, and made sure the barn was warm for Charlie and the hives. Max grew a thicker coat and insisted on sleeping by the stove. Winter brings its own rhythm, shorter days, longer nights, and a slower pace that encourages reflection. I use those evenings to mend tack, carve small wooden toys for Lily, and bake bread using Ruth's recipes. I also take time to write down stories for Lily, tales of her mother's adventures, of Charlie's mischief, and of our family's resilience. I tuck the pages into a binder so that one day she can read them to her own children. These stories aren't just entertainment. They are instructions on how to live with grace and grit. They teach lessons about honesty, hard work, and standing up for yourself. In the spring, when flowers bloom and the world wakes up from its slumber, I plan to plant a row of fruit trees. I hope to see apples and peaches hanging heavy on branches a few years from now, and if I don't, then Lily will. Planting trees is an act of faith in the future. It's a statement that says, I believe there will be someone to enjoy this shade and these fruits, even if it isn't me. Similarly, setting boundaries and writing wills are acts of faith. They say, I trust that my family will continue and will honor these decisions even after I'm gone. In many ways, this story is about legacy, not just the transfer of property, but the transfer of values. I want Emma and Lily to remember me not as a stubborn old man, but as someone who loved them enough to teach them hard lessons. I hope they remember the smell of freshly cut hay, the feel of horsehair under their fingers, and the sound of my voice reading bedtime stories. I hope they carry those sensory memories into their own homes. As I wrap up these reflections, I can't help but smile at the thought of Charlie munching on hay, Max chasing his tail, bees humming in their hives, and Lily stirring cookie dough. Life is full again because I made space for it to be. If you've stayed with me this long, I want to thank you. Your attention honors my experience and encourages me to keep sharing. Please keep telling your stories, because they matter. As the months passed after Brad moved out, I found more time to reconnect with my own past. I dusted off a box of letters from my mother, Evelyn, that had been tucked away in the attic. The letters were brittle and yellowed, but the ink was still legible, and her words felt like a warm hug. She wrote about raising me and my brothers during wartime, about rationing sugar and sewing patches on our clothes. Her resilience reminded me that I came from a line of strong women who knew how to stand their ground. I shared those letters with Emma one afternoon over coffee, and she wiped away tears as she read her grandmother's handwriting. We laughed at the parts where Evelyn scolded my father for tracking mud into the house and making a mess. Those letters became a bridge between generations, showing Emma that boundaries and love can coexist. While sorting through family papers, I discovered an old envelope addressed to me in Ruth's handwriting. I hesitated before opening it because I didn't remember ever receiving it, and my heart pounded like a drum. Inside was a note she had written before her stroke, reminding me to take care of myself and to never let anyone take advantage of my kindness. She told me to keep the farm in the family and to trust that our daughter would find her way back if I let her go. Reading Ruth's words felt like hearing her voice again, and I clutched the letter to my chest. I realized that Ruth had anticipated challenges I would face, and she left me guidance as if from beyond. What I didn't realize then was that Ruth had also left a second letter for Emma, hidden in my safe. I found it tucked beneath the deed to the house, sealed with wax like an old-time document. I debated whether to give it to Emma immediately or wait until she was ready to hear from her mother. Ultimately, I decided to hold on to it until she asked for more insight, knowing that timing matters. This decision created a quiet tension inside me, an unresolved loop that would eventually find its closure. I turned my focus to my daily routine, waking before dawn to brew coffee and watch the sky blush with morning light. After breakfast, Max and I would walk the fence line, checking for fallen posts or gaps that needed repair. Charlie would greet us at the gate, his ears flicking forward, and I'd scratch his forehead in the spot he liked best. On some mornings, I saddled him up and rode slowly down the gravel road, listening to the rhythmic clip-clop of his hooves. The physical movement and fresh air were therapeutic, giving me space to think and breathe. Along our rides, I'd pass by the creek where Emma once fell in as a child and came up laughing, soaked and muddy. That memory always made me smile, and I'd picture her pigtails dripping and her teeth chattering as I wrapped her in a blanket. Farther down the road, I saw the abandoned barn where my father and I once sought shelter from a sudden hailstorm. We huddled with the cows, listening to ice pinging off tin, and he told me stories about his own childhood. These little landmarks served as anchors for my past, reminding me of who I was before the chaos. Back at home, I'd spend the afternoons working on a series of carpentry projects. I built a new bench for the front porch, carving Emma's name on one side and Lily's on the other. I sanded each piece of wood until it felt smooth, then brushed on a coat of varnish that smelled like pine. As I worked, I thought about the ways my hands had served this family, building, repairing, and now rebuilding relationships. Carpentry is meditative. Each stroke of the plane and tap of the hammer has a rhythm that calms the mind. I also tried my hand at woodworking art, creating small birdhouses shaped like barns and painting them bright red. I donated some of these to the elementary school, where children hung them near their playground and watched bluebirds nest inside. Their laughter when the birds hatched was contagious, and it filled me with satisfaction. Beyond carpentry, I ventured into beekeeping, something I'd always wanted to try, but never had time for. I ordered a starter hive from a local supplier, complete with frames, a veil, and a smoker. On the day the bees arrived, I suited up nervously, my heart racing beneath the white suit. The hum of thousands of wings created an otherworldly sound as I carefully transferred them into their new home. Bees are fascinating creatures. They work together toward a common goal, and each bee knows its role. Watching them reminded me of how a family should operate, each member contributing without taking more than their share. As the season progressed, I harvested my first jar of honey, rich and golden, and I brought it to the next potluck. My neighbors marveled at the sweetness, and I felt proud of learning something new at my age. One evening, a young man named Scott approached me after church and asked if I would teach him how to manage bees. Scott had returned to town after serving in the Navy and wanted to start a small apiary. We began meeting once a week, and through our conversations, I learned about his experiences overseas and his struggles adjusting to civilian life. Mentoring Scott gave me a sense of purpose, and he often brought fresh ideas that kept my mind sharp. Together, we discussed not only bees but also finances, because he wanted to make his hobby sustainable. I explained the basics of budgeting, saving for emergencies, and understanding bank policies on deposits and holds. I told him that federal law requires banks to release a certain amount of deposited funds within a set time frame, but they can hold large deposits longer. He shook his head, saying he had once deposited a Navy bonus check and had to wait a week before accessing it, not realizing the reason. Sharing this knowledge with him felt like paying forward the help I'd received from Hank and others. Speaking of Hank, he continued to check on me, inviting me to breakfast at the diner on Main Street every Sunday. The diner smelled of bacon and coffee, and the waitress always greeted us by name. We sat at the same booth where Ruth and I had once shared plates of pancakes after church. Hank and I would discuss everything from politics to weather to the latest gossip about who bought which tractor. He reminded me to be vigilant, but he also encouraged me to enjoy life and not let fear dictate my actions. At one breakfast, we overheard two young men complaining about how their grandfather refused to sign over his land. They said he was being stubborn and that they deserved to inherit sooner rather than later. I wanted to turn around and tell them that inheritance is not a right. It's a gift given at the giver's discretion. Hank placed a hand on my arm and shook his head, reminding me to choose my battles wisely. That eavesdropped conversation was a pattern interrupt, a reminder that greed and entitlement are not limited to my situation. Another pattern interrupt came when I decided to take a road trip. I loaded Charlie into the trailer and hooked it to my old Ford pickup, and Max hopped into the cab. Our destination was a state park in Arkansas where my family used to camp when I was a boy. The drive was long and scenic, with rolling hills, soybean fields, and the smell of pine forests. Every few miles I'd stop to let Charlie stretch his legs and graze in roadside rest areas designated for horses. At the park, we rode through trails lined with dogwoods and hickory trees, and I felt like I'd stepped back in time. We camped near a lake where I taught Emma to fish when she was 9. She'd squealed when she caught her first bluegill. Sitting by the campfire, I thought about how cyclical life is, how we return to old haunts seeking solace. Max snored softly by my feet, and Charlie grazed nearby, silhouetted against the setting sun. In the morning I cooked bacon and eggs in a cast-iron skillet and brewed coffee over the fire, savoring the simple pleasure. I jotted down notes in my journal, describing the sounds of frogs croaking and the smell of campfire smoke. These sensory details bring me back whenever I read them later, like a mental photograph. After returning home, I decided to explore other interests. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, even though I'd never painted beyond the edges of a barn. The teacher, Ms. Lopez, encouraged us to paint what we felt rather than what we saw. I painted Charlie grazing under an oak tree with broad strokes and soft colors. Ms. Lopez said she could feel the bond between the horse and the painter, and I took that as a compliment. Painting allowed me to express emotions that words sometimes failed to capture. It also connected me with other seniors who were trying new things and refusing to be defined by age. One of my classmates, a retired nurse named Deborah, shared that she had always wanted to write a novel. We encouraged each other, and I told her about my journaling practice. She encouraged me to compile my stories into a book. The idea intrigued me, and I began collecting my narratives into thematic sections: family, farm life, grief, and resilience. One chapter will be about Charlie's role in our family and how horses reflect their owners' hearts. Another chapter will explore how rural communities can support elders facing similar struggles. I don't know if I'll ever publish this book, but the act of organizing my thoughts has been cathartic. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I remember Ruth joking about writing a cookbook. Maybe I'll include her recipes as well. During this season, I also reconnected with an old high school friend named Bill, who now lives in Colorado. We hadn't spoken in 30 years, but he reached out after hearing about my story from Hank. Bill invited me to visit his ranch, and I promised to go next summer. He shared that his own daughter had put him through a similar ordeal, trying to move him into a retirement home prematurely. Hearing his perspective reminded me that these issues span across states and backgrounds. Bill told me that he found peace by fostering dogs and teaching children to ride horses. He said that staying active and involved prevented bitterness from taking root. I wrote his words down and stuck them on my refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a chicken. On the fridge, I also keep Lily's artwork, crayon drawings of me, Charlie, Max, and her mother holding hands. Every time I open the fridge to grab milk, I see those drawings and smile, reminded of my role as a grandparent. Lily visits regularly now, and our relationship has blossomed in the absence of tension. We bake cookies, read fairy tales, and take slow walks around the farm. She loves feeding Charlie carrots and brushing his mane, just like her mother did. On one visit, Lily asked me why her mom doesn't live with me anymore. I took a deep breath and told her that grown-ups sometimes need their own space to learn and grow. I added that love doesn't always mean living under the same roof. It can be felt across miles. She seemed satisfied with that answer and continued petting Charlie, who lowered his head to her level. I often reflect on how to communicate hard truths to children without burdening them with adult complexities. Emma and I have discussed how we will handle these conversations as Lily gets older. We agreed to be honest without blaming, to emphasize respect, and to show by example that boundaries can be healthy. My relationship with Emma is not fully restored, but it is healing. We speak on the phone weekly and see each other monthly. She sometimes brings Brad, and though our interactions are polite, they remain distant. He rarely looks me in the eye. I feel no need to be cruel. I simply maintain my boundaries and focus my energy on what matters: my daughter and granddaughter. Time has softened the edges of my anger and sharpened my sense of purpose. In therapy, I've learned to let go of expectations and focus on actions. I cannot control how others behave, only how I respond. That lesson is one I wish I had learned sooner, but perhaps you cannot truly internalize it until life forces you to practice. Another thing therapy taught me is that grief and growth can coexist. You can mourn what you lost and still cultivate something new. I share this with you because I know many listeners will relate. Maybe you're facing your own ultimatum or betrayal. Please know that you are not alone. There are people who understand and resources available to help. I encourage you to seek support, whether through a counselor, a support group, or trusted friends. Reach out to your county clerk, legal aid office, or state bar for information on eviction processes and elder rights. Familiarize yourself with banking rules and keep documentation organized. It may feel tedious, but it empowers you. Documenting interactions, creating written agreements, and updating wills are acts of self-respect, not acts of distrust. I also learned that expressing gratitude can shift your mindset. Every morning, I write down 3 things I'm grateful for. Sometimes it's as simple as the taste of coffee or the way Charlie's breath forms clouds in the cold air. Other times it's gratitude for Emma calling me to share a new recipe or for Lily whispering, "I love you, Grandpa." Speaking of food, I have rediscovered the joy of cooking. I make hearty stews, cornbread, and fried chicken using cast iron like my mother did. I invite neighbors over for Sunday suppers. We break bread together, share stories, and leave with leftovers. Food has a way of bringing people together and healing wounds that words cannot reach. One Sunday, a neighbor brought a new resident, a widower named Steve, to dinner. Steve had lost his wife 2 months earlier and looked hollow-eyed. He asked me how I coped with loneliness. I told him about journaling, volunteering, and the importance of structure. I also invited him to join me on my morning walks. Over time, Steve became part of our community. He brought homemade sourdough bread to suppers and shared stories of his late wife. Watching him move from despair to engagement reminded me of my own journey. If you're listening and feel isolated, please know there is a seat at someone's table. Do not hesitate to accept invitations or to extend them. As seasons changed, I marked time with subtle cues: the first frost, the smell of cut hay, the migration of geese overhead. Each marker served as a reminder that life continues moving forward, whether we are ready or not. I found comfort in that inevitability. If nature can endure cycles of loss and renewal, so can we. On the anniversary of Ruth's passing, I visited her grave with a fresh bouquet of wildflowers. I sat on the bench I built and read aloud from my journal, telling her about the past year. I told her about the ultimatum, the court case, the bees, and the new friends. I asked her to continue guiding me. The wind rustled the leaves above, and I imagined she was listening, encouraging me with her steady presence. I also visited my father's grave and thanked him for teaching me to be firm but fair. At his headstone, I promised to honor his ledger entries by keeping my own finances in order and teaching the next generation. I slipped a small note under a rock near his name that read, "It's all working out, Dad." On my way home, I stopped by the county clerk's office to drop off some documents and met a woman named Teresa. She recognized my last name and asked if I was related to Emma. I braced myself, expecting gossip. Instead, she told me that Emma had been volunteering at a local animal shelter and was becoming an advocate for pet adoption. Hearing that made my heart swell with pride. It showed that she was reconnecting with her love of animals, perhaps influenced by her childhood with Charlie. We can change and grow, even after making mistakes. I hold on to that hope for all of us. Later that week, I invited Emma and Lily to ride Charlie together for the first time in years. Emma was hesitant, worried about being judged, but I assured her that this was about connection, not performance. She climbed onto Charlie and held Lily in front of her. They trotted around the pasture as I walked beside them. Tears rolled down Emma's cheeks and she whispered, "I'd forgotten how safe this feels." That simple act of riding together did more to heal our relationship than hours of conversation. It proved that sometimes we must revisit physical experiences to rekindle emotional bonds. After the ride, we shared lemonade on the porch and laughed about old times. We also talked about boundaries, roles, and respect. This time, the conversation was calm and collaborative. I gave Emma the letter Ruth had written for her, explaining that her mother had wanted her to read it when she was ready. She unfolded it with trembling hands and read quietly. When she finished, she hugged me and said, "Mom knew what she was talking about." That moment closed the open loop I'd been carrying. It brought a sense of resolution for both of us. In the letter, Ruth wrote about loving Emma regardless of her choices, but urged her to remember her roots and her responsibility to those who supported her. I think those words struck a chord with Emma because she began showing more initiative around her own life rather than leaning on others. She resumed her studies part-time, working toward completing her veterinary degree. She told me she felt a renewed sense of purpose when caring for animals, something Brad's real estate schemes never provided. Speaking of Brad, he eventually secured a job managing a hardware store. The glamour of flipping houses had faded. Our interactions remain cordial. We talk about weather, tools, and nothing deeper, which is fine by me. I believe in redemption for everyone, but I no longer feel responsible for orchestrating his. My focus is on the legacy I leave, the love I share, and the boundaries I set. If you take nothing else from my story, take this. You have the right to decide how your home is used and who lives there. You have the right to protect your hard-earned assets and to require respect. You also have the right to forgive without forgetting. Forgiveness frees your heart, but forgetting invites repeat patterns. I hope you also see that relationships can heal. Emma and I will never return to the exact dynamic we had when she was a child, but we are creating a new, healthier one. There will still be bumps, disagreements, and perhaps future tests, but we have tools and boundaries to navigate them. I also hope you see the power of community. I could not have navigated this without Hank, my neighbors, and new friends. If you feel alone right now, reach out. Someone is waiting to listen, to share a meal, or to offer advice. Before I end, I want to leave you with one final thought. Boundaries are not barriers to love. They are guardrails that keep relationships from crashing off cliffs. When you set them with firmness and kindness, you create space for respect to flourish. Thank you for listening to this long and winding story. Please share in the comments where you're tuning in from and what boundaries you've learned to enforce. Your insights inspire me, and I'll see you in the next story, where we'll explore how a forgotten safe deposit box revealed a family secret. Until then, take care of yourself, cherish those who cherish you, and always saddle up with integrity. In the quiet moments after finishing this story, I feel both drained and hopeful. Writing this down has been like plowing a field. Each pass of the pen turns over soil, exposing new emotions. If you made it to the end, please know your listening ears have given me companionship across the miles. I hope my words remind you that every season has its purpose and that boundaries are acts of love. Next week's tale will take us to the hidden corners of a bank vault and the secrets families hide. Until then, may your days be filled with peace, your nights with rest, and your heart with courage. Remember to water your roots and prune what drains you. Growth requires both nourishment and discipline. Share this story with a friend who might need encouragement. Sometimes hearing another's story sparks bravery. I'll be out in the barn with Charlie, brushing his coat and whispering my gratitude to the wind. Take care, and I'll meet you back here soon for another journey through resilience and redemption. Until we meet again, please leave a comment sharing your city and any lessons you've learned about standing firm. Your voices build our community, and I cherish every story shared beneath my videos.